Ladies and gentlemen, we're still continuing with our attempted conquest of scarcity. And of course, the goal overall is increased individual and societal welfare. Now, here is the problem. How do we actually measure those things? How do we measure the ideas of wealth and satisfaction within a state? Okay. Because in social sciences, in government, economics, any kind of social science history, you're presented with different types of data. And it's important to delineate between these two types of data. We have empirical data. This is data that is facts based and completely objective. Okay. We know exactly what it is. We have an idea of what it says, but it's actually based on evidence, purely fact-based evidence. We know that if I drop a ball, it's going to hit the ground. Why? Gravity. Gravity is empirical. Okay. Normative is more values-based and subjective data, and you will see this a lot in social studies. And this is why judging human behavior and trying to anticipate as we do in economics and dealing with scarcity is actually really, really hard. Um, there are two other types of data that we look at that aren't, they can be empirical or normative. And this is quantitative and qualitative types of data. Quantitative is numbers based. The usual will have some charts and graphs and tables, and we'll look a lot at those things as we go through the course. Qualitative is much more common in the social sciences. This is information that's really difficult to measure. So you're looking at it, trying to identify trends, patterns, information, things like speeches, documents, cartoons, maps, and commentaries. When you're looking at it, it's you're you're not just looking for empirically based things, or kind of in a sense, but that's much more subjective and harder to measure. So these different types of data start going into a pattern of analysis. And we can either find a causal relationships, causality, causation, or correlative relationships. This is, something that is correlated. All right. Um, when we have a causal relationship, one variable actually causes another variable to change. X created a change in Y. Why does the ball drop to the ground? Gravity. Gravity is a causal event. X caused Y. In social sciences, this is really difficult to find. Most cases, what happens is correlative relationships, where there is actually a relationship between multiple variables, but X and Y, they associate, but one doesn't necessarily cause the other. And people always like to make things in social sciences instantly causal. Um, that's really not the case. You actually have to have empirical evidence there that shows that X causes Y. A lot of people can guess why X happened and then Y did this, but it doesn't always work out that way. And so this is why in the social sciences and economics, and when we talk about government and history, you got to understand that causal relationships are much harder to find. There are, and they do exist, as we will look at, but most relationships correlate with one another, and that is identifying associations, but not necessarily causality. Okay. Now, our first measurement that we look at in terms of gauging happiness is the biggest one. It is the gross domestic product. The gross domestic product is the market value of all goods and services that is produced. Those goods and services must be new. Nothing used counts. So remember that going forward, that it would only be new goods and services that are purchased. The formula is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Well, and sometimes you'll see it as NX, net exports. Now, the C stands for consumer spending. Consumer spending is two-thirds of all GDP, and it is why it is important that, what are we looking at? We're looking at how consumers spend their money, because what that shows is that there is economic growth. When consumers spend money, that creates jobs, that creates greater industry, that produces a lot of economic growth. Number two, I. is investments. These are large purchases by business. And it also counts the buying of new homes by American consumers. This is usually a sign that, when people buy homes, it means they're gaining greater economic growth and income. When businesses are investing, what it shows is that they see a future in what they're doing, and they're taking risks. And those risks are assumed to have a greater potential for returns down the road. The G is simply government spending. Remember, government doesn't make anything. Other companies make things, and government then spends money to make those companies make things. Airplanes, guns, highways, bridges, air traffic control towers, teachers. The government doesn't make me, the government pays me to do a service. Okay. Um, Government spending is not what are called transfer payments. Like welfare is not government spending. Um, Child tax credit, food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. That's not government spending. That's programs that transfer from the government to the people. We're talking about the government actually buying something, whether that's a building or a printer ink cartridge. The last one is net exports. Net exports is exports minus imports. An export is a good or service that is sent to another country, and an import is a good or service that comes from another country. You add these things together, you get gross domestic product, otherwise known as GDP. Now, we measure economic growth through something called the business cycle. What we know is that over time, GDP goes up and down, up and down. And what we want to do is we want to make that transition from going up or down as calm as possible because we want that line of economic growth to go up, but we don't want to go so high, want it to go so high that it comes crashing back down. So how does this work? Well, when GDP goes up, of course, there's economic growth happening. That means consumers are spending a lot of money. That means people are getting hired for jobs. And of course, we know that when demand for things goes up and people have more money, prices go up. Well, eventually prices get so high that you hit a peak. And that peak is where people will say prices are too high. I'm really not interested in buying. I'm going to start putting the money in the savings account, in the pocket, under the mattress, whatever, and people stop buying goods and services. What happens? Well, if a lot of people stop buying goods and services, then prices start to drop, businesses start to lay off people, people start losing income, stop buying things, which means other businesses start getting rid of people, and you start having negative GDP growth. And by the way, that means the economic growth is going down. And we get what's called, in worst case scenario, a recession. A recession technically is two straight quarters of negative GDP growth. Remember, every year has 4 quarters. Two straight technically is a recession. Eventually, prices will drop, 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 drop until you hit a trough. And then people go and look, wow, that's pretty cheap now. Prices are nice and low. So they go back to buying and we go back into economic growth. We want this to be, we know it's going to do this. We want it to be as flat as possible so you don't have that mammoth amount of A, inflation, and B, job loss. So, what happened like 2 years ago in the summertime when prices got really, 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 really high? Well, basically, because people had a huge infusion of money coming out of COVID, this economic growth area right here just got super steep and shot up like a rocket, and so you had high inflation. Now, what's happened, people were really afraid, well, we're going to have to put ourselves in a recession and drop ourselves down so you can get prices to go back down. But what's happened is it's gone down nice and slow, nice and slow. So the economic growth is still working. The United States is actually doing extremely well around the world in helping with this. So how bad was the pandemic like in terms of economic growth? Well, take a look. This is basically everything above this line is positive GDP growth. Everything below this line is negative GDP growth. So when the pandemic hit, everybody went into their homes. People stopped spending on a lot of things. People lost their jobs, and you have literally 30% negative GDP growth. But then Donald Trump and Congress passed Operation Warp Speed, and the first pandemic payments out to people. They offered pandemic loans to businesses, and immediately, boom, it turned around and people went from buying a lot of services because the services were closed to buying all kinds of goods, and people were buying athletic leisure wear to wear at home. People were buying patio furniture and automatic heaters, and they just shifted their change in spending, and this created jobs in different industries. So you had a massive amount of economic growth right after this huge drop, and that was really unprecedented. So when it comes down to it, the pandemic hit us really hard for a short time, and then that economic growth shot right back up again. Okay. Now, the United States right now, economically, in terms of overall growth, is doing extremely well compared to other countries. Other countries are still mired in this kind of area where inflation is still really high. Jobs are actually not as prevalent as they are here in the United States. So, GDP, number one measurement of economic growth, the United States is doing very, very well. You can also measure economic growth by the sector of GDP. More advanced developed countries are going to have most of their GDP coming from the service sector. So, just basically services. Like most stuff in the United States, most of their economic growth comes from the service sector, people performing actions for each other. Developing countries have more industry related growth, and agriculture is going to be in more poorer rural countries that are lesser developed. Okay. How do countries grow or not grow? Well, economic growth comes from investments in education, which creates innovation, technology, which makes things more efficient, also promotes innovation, trade, when you get things cheaper from other countries, increasing labor force, whether that be from immigration or birth rates or whatever, that increases economic growth. Or you can do it the old fashioned way and just simply take other countries' resources, imperialism. We don't like to do that. Economic contraction, that downward trend, running out of resources, not investing in research, technology, education, the erosion of infrastructure, not fixing roads, not fixing bridges, not allowing for your country to have good ways and methods of transport and job creation. And then, of course, natural disasters. People often say, "Hey, does natural disasters increase desire for construction?" Right? No, natural disasters are a massive downward trend in terms of economic growth. Okay. So GDP, the number one way to measure how well an economy is doing.